On the morning of December the 12th, 1939, at 9:04, a Soviet scouting group of 15 men pushed through a frosted Finnish wood. The mercury read minus 40 degrees Celsius. Their thick wool jackets had become rigid, each breath condensed instantly on scarves as ice. These soldiers belonged to the vastest military on Earth, Joseph Stalin's unbeatable Red Army, dispatched to overwhelm a country of smallholders in what Moscow assumed would be a 10-day campaign. The men felt certain of victory. They were noisy, gear banged. They saw no one. They were mistaken. The first report was barely audible, a sharp crack swallowed by the snow. A soldier at the rear simply slumped. No blast, no shout. He vanished. The lieutenant at the head halted. He whirled. There was nothing to see. 3 seconds later, another shot sounded. The lieutenant's gaze flicked forward as his radio operator, 200 meters ahead, toppled. This time, the lieutenant thought he registered a hiss, just a fraction before the strike. Panic followed. The patrol threw themselves into the drifts, but the snow offered no shelter. It became a slaughter ground. The firing continued. Crack. One man collapsed trying to ready his machine gun. Crack. Another sergeant, pointing a direction, pitched backward. Crack. Crack. In under 3 minutes, 12 were slain. The remaining 3, horror-struck, did not flee. They lay in the snow for 4 hours, frozen, pleading not to be chosen next. When they finally crawled back, their report baffled their commanders. There had been no muzzle flare, no evidence of a sniper team, no clue to the shooter's location. It was as if a specter had killed them. A Belaya Smirt, the White Death. What those survivors did not grasp, and what Red Army headquarters would soon understand, was that the apparition was not supernatural. It was a 33-year-old farmer, a modest, quiet man, scarcely 5 feet 3 inches tall, a private citizen who, by declaring a private war against an empire, became its nightmare. He relied on a tactic so straightforward and counterintuitive, it altered the practice of modern marksmanship. This account follows Simo Häyhä and the unadorned adjustments that rendered him the deadliest rifleman ever recorded. To see how a solitary villager could terrorize an army, the conflict's context must be known. The campaign was, in many ways, a contest that should never have happened. A real David versus Goliath. In November 1939, Stalin demanded Finnish territory. Islands, bases, buffer zones he viewed as shields against a potential German attack. Finland, led by Marshal Mannerheim, said no. Stalin reacted. On November 30th, after staging a manufactured incident, Soviet forces crossed the border. The imbalance was absurd. Moscow poured 1 million soldiers over the line. Finland could muster about 300,000, largely reservists and part-time fighters. The Soviets deployed some 6,000 tanks. Finns had 32. Soviet air strength numbered 3,000 aircraft. Finnish flyers totaled 114. Observers felt sympathy for Helsinki. Time magazine predicted doom. Soviet doctrine, deep battle, relied on sheer mass. Political officers assured troops they would march into Helsinki in days and packed parade dress for victory. But the invaders repeated a perennial error. They read the raw totals on a map, not the land. They launched in the heart of winter. The cold was absolute. They invaded a nation that was 70% woodland. The Finns had a concept they clung to, Sisu, a stubborn, gritty courage, a reserve of resolve. They recognized they could not defeat the Red Army in conventional set-piece battles. So they refused to try. They let armor advance, channeled it across frozen lakes, and then shattered the ice with shells. They allowed vast columns to funnel down scant forest lanes, and then cut sections off. Ski troops, wrapped in white, silent and nearly invisible, emerged from the trees, wrecked kitchens, eliminated officers, and melted away. They called these ambushes Motti tactics, severing mile-long convoys into smaller pockets the Finns could handle. And they let the climate finish what they had started. The cold was Finland's ally. At -40, engines seized, tank lubricants hardened. Soviet soldiers wearing ineffectual green-brown coats showed up like black dots against the snow. Thousands froze to death, sometimes upright, their weapons frozen in their hands. This was the trap the Red Army had walked into. And on the Kollaa Front, amid this nightmare, stood a humble farmer. Simo Häyhä was no lifelong soldier. From Rautjärvi, near the new border, he farmed and had been a prize marksman in the local civil guard. At 33, he joined the 34th Infantry Regiment. Watching the Soviet tide invade his homeland, he found his Sisu. He also possessed a practiced skill. Häyhä was not only accurate, he understood shooting under Arctic conditions better than the doctrinaire manual's authors. Given an M28-30 rifle, a Finnish adaptation of the Mosin-Nagant, he had a trustworthy, precise weapon with plain iron sights. His captain offered him a modern rifle fitted with a Soviet PE-4 scope. Optics were the vogue. Scopes magnified enemies. Armies craved them. Häyhä declined. That refusal was his first unorthodox choice. Officers saw folly. He saw logic. The issue was not the firearm, but the freeze. Häyhä knew three practical truths overlooked by sniper schools. First, a scope's glass can flash. Even a shaded lens can capture the low winter sun and throw a tiny gleam visible at 500 meters. Against white terrain, that glint meant death. Iron sights were matte metal, no shine. Second, scope's fog. The harsh cold meeting the warmth at a shooter's eye will blur a lens. You raise the rifle and see only white until you clear it. By then, the target may have gone, or worse, noticed you. Third, optics force you to lift your head. To frame the sight picture, you need to raise your cheek a few inches higher than with iron sights. In a flat snowfield, those inches separate the hunter from the hunted. Häyhä kept iron sights. He valued simplicity and knew his effective window, about 150 to 400 meters, so magnification was unnecessary. He'd honed marksmanship while hunting on his own land, and reliability trumped novelty. Yet this was merely the opening of his innovations. His subsequent adjustments were even more elemental and startlingly clever. Soviet counter-snipers looked for two giveaways. First, muzzle blast. A rifle's discharge kicks up snow ahead of the barrel, a little puff easily read as a locator. Häyhä solved this by constructing a shooting platform. He would compact the snow where his barrel would rest, pour water over it, and let it freeze into a solid slab of ice. When he fired, the blast was absorbed. No white puff, no clue. Second, they watched for breath. At 40 below, warm exhalations hang in the air like pale smoke. An anxious marksman betrays himself with each inhalation and sigh. Häyhä's answer was famously simple. He kept a wad of snow in his mouth. The frozen ball chilled the air in his mouth, so his breath matched the outside temperature. No white cloud, no giveaway. Picture an opposing sniper sweeping the landscape through a gleaming scope, searching for a raised head, a puff of blown snow, a steaming breath, and finding none. No glint, no plume, no revealing silhouette. Häyhä became effectively invisible, a product of practical thinking born from life in the cold. Then he began to work. His regimen was unforgiving. He rose before dawn, packed provisions of bread and sugar, donned layered white clothing for concealment, took his M28-30, a Suomi submachine gun, and skis, told his comrades he was going hunting, and slid alone into the dead space beyond the front. He would select a subtle knoll or a fallen trunk, build a small hide, tamp the snow, place the icy ball in his mouth, and wait. Hours crawled. The cold settled into him. Other men would shiver and shift, activity that ruins precision. Häyhä showed Sisu. He steadied himself against pain and numbness. Then a target appeared. An officer absorbed in a map at 300 meters. Crack. A machine gun crew setting up at 250. Crack. A man running for shelter at 350 crack. Häyhä rarely fired multiple shots from the same location. After a hit, he would ski 100 meters to a fresh post and resume. Soviet artillery often pulverized his previous hides, leveling trees and leaving scorched trunks, but he had already moved to a better angle. Each evening he returned. When Lieutenant Utalainen asked his tally, Häyhä brushed off the question with a small figure. 5. The next day, 8, then 12. Doubts arose. Officers thought the tallies improbable. Sniping doctrine suggested a handful of kills over weeks, not dozens. They sent an observer who returned pale and confirmed the counts. The numbers could not be ignored. On December 21st, 1939, Häyhä was credited with 25 eliminations. On the 22nd, 23rd. On Christmas Day, his total for a single day rose to 38. It was carnage by a single shooter. At Kollaa, the front chewed men. The Red Army threw massive formations, 12 divisions and some 160,000 troops, against 4 Finnish divisions. Outnumbered, the Soviets advanced in waves. Machine guns shredded them. Mati ambushes carved them. And then the Ghost harried them. Morale frayed. It is one thing to be felled by distant explosives. It is another to be picked off by a hidden enemy. Men refused patrols. Officers stayed under cover. Those who lit fires for warmth were cut down. Squads that clustered for safety were wiped out when Häyhä switched to the Suomi and emptied a drum into them. He became more than a sniper. He was a psychological weapon, creating a forbidden depth to the front. Reports of a Belaya Smirt reached Stavka. The legend unnerved Soviet command. Their proud doctrine, tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft, had stalled against woods, skis, and a single mythic man. The response hardened. Task forces would hunt the phantom. Regular patrols were abandoned. They simply lost men. Moscow dispatched elite counter-snipers, veterans from their schools with new SVT-40 rifles and glinting optics. Häyhä picked them off, too. A single iron sight shot could crack through a scope. Artillery barrages blanketed sectors where single shots occurred. On one day, Häyhä's post endured more than 100 shells. Trees were ripped apart. The earth became churned black mud. Command assumed he was dead. An hour later, he walked in, blood and dirt streaking his snow kit, bearing shrapnel wounds and a shrug. They were loud today. The fixation grew. At last, Moscow ordered a dedicated counter-sniper platoon, 30 of its best men, backed by machine guns, tasked solely with finding and killing the White Death. The armada of millions was now hunting a single human. The platoon moved into the forest at dawn. 30 capable shooters, confident. Radios crackling, scopes catching scarce sunlight. Hunters with a singular purpose. Häyhä was not on a tree line. He lay buried in a drift 400 meters from their route. His M28-30 rested on its ice pad, and his white clothing a flawless disguise. He waited for them for hours. When they finally strode by, their boots thumped and their rifles flashed. He let the first group pass. He waited for the man at the rear and fired. The radio man fell without a cry. The report was gone before the leader registered it. Instant confusion followed. The platoon dived for cover. Machine guns opened on the wood. They sprayed trees and snow, but hit nothing. Häyhä was already gone. He did not run. He skied, soundless, 300 meters to a prepared flank position he had made earlier. The Soviets, assuming the sniper had fled, sent men forward. A shot from the left struck the lieutenant down. The platoon now had no leader and no radio. Darkness fell, and with it, panic. The temperature dipped further. Men needed warmth. Orders forbade fires, but survival instincts prevailed. 6 men clustered to kindle a small blaze. It was the fatal error. Häyhä appeared, his form a pale specter, not with the M28-30, but with his Suomi. He sprang from the trees and emptied a 71-round drum into the huddle. The massacre was over within seconds. The remainder of the platoon scattered into the forest, directionless. Häyhä did not pursue. He had no need. The environment did the rest. Finnish patrols later found 27 bodies. The elite hunters were gone. This was psychological warfare incarnate. The terror the White Death sowed outweighed the physical losses. Diaries and letters from Soviet soldiers convey the fear. A man named Pavel in the 75th Rifle Division wrote home, "Mother, this isn't war, this is hell. We do not fear bullets, we fear silence." Their doctrine portrayed silence as peace. Here, silence meant Simo watched. When shells paused, hearts stopped too. Pavel listed unwritten rules: never light a fire, never rush to aid a fallen comrade, never bunch up or walk alone. Each choice could be a death sentence. These rules were the ripples from Häyhä's small measures: no scope glint, ice to absorb muzzle blasts, snow in his mouth to hide breath. They were more than tricks, they were torture. He had stripped away every human sign of the hunter. He had become the winter's personification. Stavka panicked. Elite snipers failed. Counter-sniper platoons were annihilated. Artillery could not silence him. Frontline morale neared collapse. The Kollaa sector, strategically significant, stalled not merely from Finnish resistance, but from the legend of one man. As a final resort, Stalin's command embraced brute force, grid-square removal. If precision could not eliminate him, they would obliterate the forest. They brought heavier guns, howitzers, and mortars in quantity. They ceased waiting for maneuvers and unleashed continuous bombardment, day and night, turning the once pure white Kollaa woods into a charred, blackened wasteland. Under the relentless bombardment, the forest ceased to resemble a battlefield and became a cratered graveyard of splintered trunks and burned snow. The Red Army fired until even their gunners' ears rang, and the barrels steamed in the cold. They believed no living thing could survive that deluge. Yet when silence returned and the smoke cleared, Finnish scouts found a familiar figure crawling from the blackened snow, brushing soot from his uniform. Simo Häyhä had endured once again. His face was cut and his uniform torn, but his rifle still functioned. He simply returned to his post and resumed his vigil, calm as ever. The Russians could not comprehend how a man could persist amid such devastation. Their morale was collapsing faster than their lines. Reports flooded Moscow describing entire battalions refusing to advance, officers unable to force movement, men abandoning weapons in terror of a phantom they had never seen. The legend of the White Death had grown into something larger than war, an embodiment of the Arctic itself, a faceless judgment descending from the frozen woods. Even Finnish soldiers who fought near his sector whispered that Simo was more spirit than man, a piece of winter come alive to defend his homeland. By February 1940, Häyhä's confirmed kill count had surpassed 500. His comrades estimated many more unrecorded. No sniper in history had achieved such precision or endurance under those conditions. But the war that had forged him was nearing its bitter end. The Soviets, humiliated yet inexhaustible, finally began to adapt. They used sheer mass to smother the Finnish defenses, advancing behind rolling artillery curtains that no marksman could stop. Every kilometer was bought with blood and ice. In early March, after more than 3 months of brutal fighting, the Red Army finally forced Finland to the negotiation table. The Winter War concluded with heavy losses on both sides. Finland was compelled to cede territory, but it remained an independent nation, something few had believed possible when the invasion began. For Häyhä, the end nearly came before the ceasefire. On March the 6th, 1940, he took position near the village of Kollaa once again. The day was clear, the snow reflecting blinding light. He had already struck down several advancing soldiers when a Soviet sniper, perhaps one of the few who still dared to hunt the ghost, spotted a flicker of movement in the drifts. A single explosive bullet struck Häyhä in the lower left jaw. The round shattered his face and exited near his ear. His comrades found him unconscious, but alive, his features unrecognizable. They dragged him from the front line as shells thundered around them. He remained in a coma for a week and awoke on March 13th, the day the peace treaty was signed. The war ended the same day the White Death returned to the world of the living. Recovery took years. Surgeons reconstructed his face piece by piece. The left side remained sunken and scarred, but his sight and his spirit endured. After the war, journalists and foreign observers sought him out, eager to meet the man whose name had terrified the Soviet Union. They expected a giant, a fierce warrior, someone carved from myth. Instead, they found a quiet, modest farmer with clear blue eyes and a soft voice. He rarely spoke about killing. When asked how he had achieved so many confirmed kills, he answered simply, "Practice." When pressed about whether he regretted it, he said, "I did what I was told, as well as I could." His simplicity disarmed those who came to glorify him. To Simo, it had never been about numbers or fame. It had been about Finland, his home, his fields, his people. In the decades that followed, Häyhä lived quietly in the countryside, tending his farm and breeding hunting dogs. He hunted game, skied in the winters, and occasionally met young soldiers who sought his advice. He would show them his old rifle, the same iron-sighted M2830, and teach them patience and silence. When asked about his legendary skill, he smiled faintly and said, "You must love the cold." Finland, rebuilt and fiercely proud, never forgot him. During his lifetime, he received medals and recognition from both military historians and his nation's government. But he remained humble, declining interviews whenever possible. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a survivor, one who had done his duty when called. Historians later analyzed how his simple methods anticipated modern stealth doctrine. His use of natural camouflage, control of thermal signature, and management of muzzle blast mirrored techniques later formalized by special forces. Yet his genius had come from intuition and necessity, not science. He had applied the logic of the land to warfare, used the terrain, trust the cold, and waste nothing. Modern snipers study his methods to this day, astonished at the precision he achieved without optics or assistance. His longest confirmed shot, over 400 meters with iron sights, remains a feat almost unimaginable under Arctic conditions. But beyond statistics, Häyhä's legacy lies in what he represented. He showed that technology and numbers do not guarantee victory when willpower and knowledge of one's environment stand against them. The Winter War, though a defeat on paper became a moral victory for Finland, proving that courage, ingenuity, and sheer determination, Sisu, could humble even the largest army in the world. The Soviet Union would go on to defeat Nazi Germany, yet in its archives, reports of the White Death remained a haunting reminder that the human spirit can become as deadly as any weapon. As old age approached, Häyhä never married. He continued to live near the forest where he had once fought. Visitors described his home as modest, filled with trophies from hunting, not war. He kept his rifle clean and functional until his final years. When he finally passed away in 2002 at the age of 96, Finland mourned him not as a killer, but as a national symbol, a quiet embodiment of resilience. Soldiers carried his coffin draped in the blue and white flag he had defended. Veterans saluted. On that bitter March day, the air was cold again, and snow drifted softly over the cemetery. They say that even in death, Simo Häyhä remained part of the winter he had mastered. His legend still echoes through the forests of Karelia, where the wind moans through the pines and the snow lies untouched. Somewhere in that silence, one can almost imagine a faint crack, the echo of a single, perfect shot, and then nothing but the stillness he loved. If the Red Armies might symbolize the brutality of the 20th century, then Häyhä symbolized its paradox. The lone individual standing against overwhelming force. His war was not fought with hatred, but with precision, patience, and survival. His story endures because it reminds the world that courage can exist without cruelty, and that sometimes the deadliest weapon in war is not technology or ideology, but one man's quiet determination. The landscape looked like another planet, barren, cratered, and lifeless. The Finns called it the Kollaa Holocaust, a wasteland born of unending artillery. Tens of thousands of shells screamed down every day, gouging the frozen earth and filling the air with smoke and flame. Amid that inferno, Simo Häyhä still moved, quiet as ever. The chaos that destroyed others became his camouflage. The roar of explosions hid the sharp crack of his rifle. The endless thunder covered his deadly rhythm. Fire, reload, shift, repeat. He drifted through the bomb-torn field like a phantom, weaving among shattered trees and ice-filled craters. His tally rose relentlessly, 200, 300, 400. Each day brought another record. By early March 1940, less than 100 days after the first shot of the Winter War, his officially confirmed sniper kills had reached 505. That number alone equaled an entire battalion, erased by one man, using nothing but a bolt-action rifle and iron sights. The count didn't even include the 200 or more enemies he felled with his Suomi submachine gun. No other soldier on Earth matched such lethality. The Finnish High Command took notice. To them, Häyhä was no longer just a corporal in white camouflage. He was a national treasure, a living legend. In an unprecedented decision, they promoted him directly to second lieutenant, the fastest promotion ever recorded in Finland's military history. They presented him with a custom rifle, a beautifully engraved Kollaa M 2830, bearing his name along the barrel. But recognition came with risk. To the Red Army, he was no longer a man. He was a threat that had to be erased. Then came March 6th, 1940, the 100th day of the war. The Soviets were throwing everything they had into a final, desperate assault on the Kollaa Front. Häyhä was, as always, in position before dawn. But this time the world around him was pure chaos. The air was thick with artillery fire and mortar blasts. He fired again and again, reloading as fast as his frozen fingers allowed. Several enemies had already fallen under his aim that morning, but the Russians had learned. They knew roughly where their unseen tormentor hid. Mortars rained down on his sector, pounding the snow into boiling steam. Amid that storm of destruction, fate or chance found him. Somewhere in the confusion, a single Soviet counter-sniper spotted movement. We will never know his name, nor whether he knew who his target was. He fired a single shot, not with a standard round, but with an explosive bullet. Häyhä was lining up his next target when it struck. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. The explosive round hit him squarely in the left cheek, detonating inside his mouth. His jaw shattered, his teeth were blown apart, and half of his face was ripped open. He felt no pain, only a sudden shock, a dull thud, a flash of white, and the sensation of warmth spreading across his frozen skin. He tried to breathe, but blood and fragments filled his throat. Darkness swallowed him. Nearby, Finnish soldiers saw him fall. They raced through gunfire to reach him. One later said that half of Simo's head seemed gone. They believed him dead. They carried what they thought was a corpse back behind the lines, placing him among the others who had fallen that day. The White Death, it seemed, had finally met his own. The ghost of Kollaa lay silent beneath a gray sky. But the story was not over. Hours passed. The fighting raged. Then, as one soldier walked past the heap of bodies, he saw movement. Just a faint twitch of a leg. He stopped, looked closer. The man with the ruined face was breathing. Barely, but breathing. Against every probability, Simo Häyhä was alive. He had been unconscious for days, half buried among the dead, and yet his heart still beat. His face was mutilated, his cheekbone gone, his jaw obliterated. But his legendary Finnish Sisu, that untranslatable mix of courage and endurance, remained unbroken. They rushed him to a field hospital. Surgeons worked frantically. The war, however, was ending. Within a week, March 13th, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Häyhä lay in a coma through it all. He slept through the end of the Winter War, through the silence that fell over the wrecked forests of Kollaa. On paper, Finland had lost. The treaty demanded the surrender of 11% of its territory, yet the cost to the Soviet Union was staggering. Over 1 million casualties, more than 3,500 tanks, and 600 aircraft destroyed. Stalin's promised 2-week conquest had turned into a 105-day nightmare. The supposedly invincible Red Army had been stopped, humiliated, by a nation of barely 4 million farmers and hunters. And behind much of that terror stood one small man with an old rifle. Historians later called this the ripple effect, the way one person's actions could alter global events. For while Stalin counted his losses, another dictator was watching from afar. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler studied the Soviet failure in Finland with growing interest. He saw an army that was clumsy, disorganized, and afraid, one that could barely overcome a nation 1/20th its size. To him, the Winter War was proof that the Soviet Union was a fragile, hollow power waiting to collapse under pressure. And so, in part because of what he had seen in Finland, because of the fear spread by the White Death, Hitler's confidence grew. A year later, in June 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Some historians argue that had the Red Army not appeared so incompetent in Finland, had soldiers like Häyhä not exposed its flaws, Hitler might have hesitated. Instead, he attacked, setting in motion one of the bloodiest campaigns in human history. While the world changed, Simo fought a different kind of war. His body became the battlefield. Doctors performed 26 surgeries in total. They rebuilt his shattered face from fragments of bone. Using pieces of his hip bone, they crafted a new jaw. Skin grafts from his thigh became his new cheek. He spent 14 months in hospitals and years in rehabilitation. When at last he emerged, the man who had once terrified entire armies was permanently scarred, his face marked forever by the price of his legend. But he survived, and in Finland, survival was victory. The government honored him publicly. Marshal Mannerheim personally awarded him the Cross of Kollaa and confirmed his battlefield promotion. He had done more for the nation's defense than perhaps any single soldier. When the Continuation War broke out in 1941, Häyhä asked to return to combat. The army declined. His injuries were too severe, his face too fragile for the strain of recoil and cold. The White Death would never hunt again. So what becomes of a man who was once the deadliest soldier alive when the killing stops? For Häyhä, the answer was simple. He went home. His old farm lay on land now ceded to the Soviets, so the government granted him a new property further west. There, he returned to what he had always been before the war, a farmer and hunter. For the next 5 decades, he lived quietly, raising hunting dogs and earning fame once more. Not as a sniper, but as one of Finland's most skilled moose hunters. His instincts, his patience, his mastery of the wilderness, all remained intact. He rarely spoke of war. When reporters found him decades later, they were astonished by his modesty. Asked how he became the White Death, he only shrugged. When pressed about killing more than 500 men, his reply was pure, unadorned Finnish logic. I did what I was told to do, and I did it as well as I could. In 1998, when a journalist asked the 92-year-old veteran for the secret to his deadly accuracy, Simo smiled faintly and gave a single-word answer. Practice. James McKenna had his 6 inches of piano wire. Simo Häyhä had his iron sights. Both men, separated by oceans, saw flaws in the doctrines that experts swore were unbreakable. McKenna defied technical manuals. Häyhä defied modernity itself. Where engineers saw the necessity of optics, he saw only reflection, a shimmer that betrayed life. Where generals saw theory, he saw survival. The farmer's vision pierced through the academic fog of warfare. In his simplicity lay genius, the refusal to overcomplicate what nature had already taught him. The military elite had been blinded by technology and procedure. Simo, by contrast, trusted instinct and the cold wisdom of experience. To him, snow was not an obstacle, but a tool. The cold, not an enemy, but a shield. Each frozen breath, each patch of glare ice, every drifting flake was part of his arsenal. Where textbooks offered equations, he offered adaptation, and in the end, that difference between doctrine and intuition carved a legend that would outlive nations. He never sought fame. While the world lauded his record, Häyhä himself receded into the woods, content to vanish into the rhythm of rural life. He hunted, farmed, and trained his dogs, preferring the company of silence over applause. When foreign journalists visited, expecting a grim warrior or a stoic philosopher, they found a small, gentle man with clear eyes and a faint, crooked smile, the smile of one who had seen both life and death and chosen peace. He spoke sparingly, and when he did, his words carried the weight of a man who had no need to justify himself. Asked once whether he regretted killing so many, he answered simply, I did what I was ordered to do. There was no boast, no remorse, only the matter-of-fact acceptance of duty done. His humility baffled interviewers. It was as if the man who had terrified an empire saw no greatness in his own acts. In time, his fame transformed from myth into symbol. The White Death was not remembered for cruelty, but for precision and restraint. His record of 505 confirmed sniper kills remains unmatched in history, a number that military historians still struggle to comprehend. Yet he never glorified violence. He understood it as a necessity, forced upon ordinary people by extraordinary times. He became a quiet figure in Finnish folklore, a living embodiment of Sisu, that national trait of resilience and endurance. School children learned his name as one learns that of a folk hero. Hunters quoted his techniques. Modern snipers studied his patience. And while armies around the world adopted thermal scopes and laser sights, many instructors still reminded recruits that the deadliest marksman in history used none of them. In the late 1990s, as the century closed, television crews visited him in his small wooden home in Ruokolahti. They found him sitting near the fireplace, feeding his dogs bits of bread, surrounded by hunting trophies rather than medals. The scars still marked the left side of his face, a permanent reminder of the war that had taken so much and yet had failed to break him. He spoke with the same steady calm he had shown in the snowdrifts 60 years before. When one reporter asked him what he thought of modern warfare, satellites, drones, guided missiles, he chuckled softly and said, "It is all the same. You still have to see your target." That simple line summarized his philosophy. Technology may change, but the essence of conflict, focus, patience, and will, remains eternal. Simo Häyhä died in 2002 at the age of 96. His funeral was quiet, attended by soldiers, hunters, and farmers. The coffin, draped in the blue and white of Finland's flag, was lowered into the frozen ground of his homeland. The air was cold that day, and snowflakes drifted slowly through the pine trees. It was as if the land itself had paused to honor the man who had once turned winter into his ally. Even in death, he remained part of the landscape he had defended. In Finland, his name became a whisper associated with endurance, discipline, and unshakable calm. Military academies still study his methods, not for the body count, but for the mindset, the absolute control, the unity between man and environment. His legacy is not in the number of lives he ended, but in the precision with which he lived. War stories often glorify grand strategies, vast armies, and the clash of nations. But the truth, as Simo's life demonstrated, lies in the hands of individuals, the mechanic in the tropics improvising with piano wire, the farmer in the snow mastering silence. History turns not only on the decisions of generals, but on the small, defiant acts of those who see a better way and dare to follow it. That is how wars are truly fought, not merely with weapons, but with character, not through scale, but through spirit. Today, when winter winds sweep across Karelia and the forest falls silent beneath the snow, some claim you can still feel his presence. The trees whisper, the cold tightens its grip, and for a fleeting moment it seems the forest itself remembers. Somewhere, perhaps, the faint echo of a distant rifle shot still lingers. A single, perfect crack in the still air, and then, as always, silence.